going to pull up. Great. Well, Lindsay Cornelius is our presenter this evening, as she introduced herself earlier. So she is the natural area manager for the Columbia Land Trust, stewarding thousands of acres of oak habitat, primarily in the Klickitat watershed. She also manages the East Cascades Oak Partnership, which recently completed its strategic action plan that we're going to hear about tonight. And academically, Lindsay has a bachelor's in environmental science from Western Washington University, but feels her most valuable educational experiences by far have been from observing the oak woodlands and natural areas. So Lindsay, if you're ready to.
All right, I'm going to share my screen here. Maybe it'll start. There we go. Hold on 1 second. I am going to turn off my camera because I often have trouble with my internet connection. So hopefully it won't foul us up too much here. So thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. You guys are a little bit like guinea pigs because I haven't presented the full strategic plan before. So bear with me if it's a little clunky. But I wanted to start just by sharing a little bit about what makes oaks so attractive to me. I'm very fond of Oregon white oak. You know, they grow in these massive and spreading forms over a riot of wildflowers in the oak savanna, and then they can also be very small and huddled in tight groups against driving winds on bluffs. They persist in shallow or fertile soils and dry or wet places. They produce abundant acorn crops, and they resprout after fire, so super resilient. They provide shade in harsh environments for people and livestock. And I have rested under many an oak tree on a hot day. They support important first food and game species. They host some of the richest pollinator habitat in the Pacific Northwest, and they have energy-rich, dense wood that makes really great firewood for those of us who burn it for warmth. They provide a beautiful backdrop for recreation, which is at the heart of our tourism economy, and their natural fire resistance can serve as a buffer against catastrophic wildfire. Oak systems support, oh my goodness, hold on, it's not, my slides are not advancing. There they go. Oak systems support hundreds of species of wildlife, including many rare, threatened, and endangered species, and also culturally important species to the tribes. And by virtue of their hollow core and their gaping cavities, they also provide really important resources that both living and dead trees provide. So it's kind of a remarkable tree in that regard. For that reason, you'll hear me talking about oak systems a lot as opposed to oak habitat. Oak systems is a reference not just to the oaks themselves, but to hundreds of associated species that utilize or grow in association with oaks. So in my opinion, lots of reasons to love oaks right out of the gate. Oaks exist at lower elevations where people are concentrated. So there's a great deal of direct interaction between people and oak systems, and that usually means there's more impact, and there's also more opportunity for connections between people and oak systems. People have been present in the oak landscape since time immemorial, but the pace and scale of ecological change in the oak landscape has really accelerated since European settlement, especially as the interactions between people and these systems have shifted from a more cultural ecology of seasonal rounds that were practiced by the tribes to a more of an extractive mindset. This map shows approximate geographies of where indigenous languages were commonly spoken, and I like it because it gives a more robust picture of the cultural richness of our region than do the discrete political boundaries of reservations, which of course are still very important. But this history can provide us with an understanding of how ecological systems that we're working in today have shifted in response to past human behaviors. And that can inform management and help us articulate our desired future condition toward which we're managing. And history is conveyed to us through written records, like from Lewis and Clark journals. It's a very popular citation for historical condition, through missions, through trading companies and US military, which I'll touch on in a minute, but it's also, history is also conveyed to us by tribal elders who use language to convey knowledge from generation to generation. And Lavina Wilkins, an elder who is a language scholar and a native speaker with the Yakima Nation, agreed to come talk to the East Cascades Oak Partnership 2 years ago, and I'll tell you more about that later. But she shared some of what she learned with us when, as a young girl, still living with her grandmother. And we feel really grateful to Lavina for that sharing. Somehow found the grace and to trust us with some of her knowledge, despite living through some pretty traumatic attempts by the US government to separate her from her family and her culture. So we're grateful to Lavina for sharing her perspective with us. So she told us about these grinding bowls, which are right here. There's a picture of one in the lower left corner. And these are made, they take a century to make. Children would go into the woods under the supervision of elders to tie knots in really young oak trees. And then as those trees mature, the wood within the knots would get really hard. And 100 years later, using oral history to convey the locations of the trees where the knots were tied, the knots would be harvested and then hollowed out to make grinding bowls. This is a picture of an actual knot that had not yet been turned into a bowl. So Lavina tells us that each bowl lasted about 100 years. So by the time one wore out, another one was ready to be created. She also shared stories about how they leached tannins out of acorns before roasting them, about grinding acorns and roots. And when we asked if her ancestors did any prescriptive burning to maintain any of the features of oak woodlands here in the East Cascades, as was practiced in the Willamette Valley, she said no. They let nature take care of herself. They did not light fires to maintain oak, but they also didn't need to. The hot, dry summers and frequent lightning strikes were enough to maintain oak. And perhaps most significantly, they did not put fires out or suppress them. That's important when we try to reconstruct our understanding of oak system response to disturbance for management today. So speaking of disturbance, sorry, having a little drink. Following European arrival, which really started to accelerate in the late 1700s and early 1800s with the fur trade, the fur desert policy practiced by trading companies nearly extirpated beavers from the Pacific Northwest. And the removal of beavers was, as you know, profoundly impactful to riparian and wetland ecological systems, but the presence of organized trading companies and settlements provide some of the earliest examples of European-style agriculture in the region, which would have profound impacts on upland ecological systems as well. And similarly, religious missions and the US military and phenomena like the gold rush were vehicles through which European agriculture was introduced and then expanded throughout the American West, really. There are many accounts of highly productive, deeply loamy soils on the Columbia Plateau supporting lush grasses in historical records. And these deep soils were first used to raise sheep and beef. They were used for grazing. But eventually the conversion of those lowlands to dry land agriculture like wheat forced grazing into the uplands and under the oaks. And grazing practices that were imported with our ancestors, European ancestors from the European continent, were perfectly adapted for European grasses. And these were grasses which responded really well to spring cropping. But the perennial bunch grasses that were native here to the American West and many of the diverse flowering forbs that grow in between those bunch grasses were not well adapted to spring cropping. So we're going to talk about some of the impacts of those spring grazing practices later. So as more and more settlers arrived, transportation corridors were expanded beyond those used by indigenous peoples. And from about 1850 until about 1880, the primary means of transportation, apart from livestock and wagons, were portage railways and steamships, all of which required fuel to run. So there were 3 steamships making multiple trips per day, and each trip required about 40 cords of wood per leg. And these trips were made over a 30-year period. So would have required a very large volume of cordwood, which likely was harvested from as near the water and rail lines as possible. And this very likely had an impact on the oaks nearest these corridors, so up the Klickitat River and along the Columbia primarily, and up the Deschutes. We can discern from the Lewis and Clark journal entries around 1805 that oaks in this region were primarily smaller oaks that were well adapted to frequent fire and the hot, dry summers east of the Cascades. And this makes sense when you consider the oaks here are a temperate species at the edge of their natural range, and they're only here at all because of the moderating climatic influence of the Columbia River Gorge. So, you know, the place we live, the East Cascades ecoregion, is incredibly unique because of how the Columbia River bisects the Cascade Mountain Range. The climatic influence of the gorge on the vegetation in this region, paired with really sharp precipitation and elevation gradients. It's only like a 40-mile linear distance from the crest of the Cascades to the Columbia Plateau, but there's a great deal of topographic diversity within that 40 miles, and there's a really steep precipitation gradient, you know, somewhere around 120 inches of rain a year to less than 10. And so those really steep gradients result in a highly ecotonal landscape with a lot of microclimates. And that leads to species richness and a high occurrence of endemic species. Those are species that in all the world only grow here. So how did oaks get here? Oaks as a genus first showed up in the fossil record in the Cretaceous period, so between 66 and 145 million years ago. And they emerged in a tropical montane environment, so wet and warm. By the late Eocene, Quercus garryana as a species had emerged in the fossil record, and it shows up in a more temperate Mediterranean climate. But its genetic roots in that more tropical context might explain why it grows more vigorously in warm, wet places like the Willamette Valley, where oaks can grow very large. So how does a plant that loves these moderate climates exist in an ecoregion with some pretty extreme climatic features? And the answer is the Columbia River Gorge. So marine air, you know, from the west to the Cascades flows through the Columbia River Gorge in a phenomenon that climatologists call gap flow, gorge gap flow. And that air kind of curls around either side and then plumes out over the Columbia Basin. And that allows cooler, moisture air in the summer, which is what allows Oregon white oaks to populate the east of the Cascades. This doesn't mean that they're less robust here. In fact, they thrive. One of the most recognizable seeds in the world, the acorn, is a large seed with high moisture content that's easily killed by desiccation and heat, but it establishes really rapidly due to its high nutrient content, and it actually has really high germination success. Being so large, being such a large seed, oaks rely on jays and squirrels and woodpeckers and other animals that cache seeds for dispersal. And they're so effective at dispersal, in fact, these critters, that following a catastrophic fire in Southern Oregon, the Forest Service erected nest boxes and platforms and then filled them with acorns and let the jays do the lion's share of the oak reforestation. So I thought that was a pretty clever strategy for using ecological processes to restore forests. Oaks have evolved a natural control on acorn predation, though, in that they mast, or they suddenly and seemingly unpredictably produce a bumper crop of acorns. And during those bumper crops, the predators just can't keep up with how many acorns are produced, and so many of those acorns survive to germinate. And then, of course, other germination happens when those cached acorns are forgotten about or not, again, relocated by their predator. So through research led by Dr. David Peter at the Pacific Northwest Research Station in Olympia, we learned that there's a high degree of synchrony in oak masting, and that dry springs and cold falls precede bumper acorn crops. Given how dry our spring was this year, if we have a cold fall, it'll be interesting to see what the acorn crop of 2022 looks like. I'm kind of excited to see. Hopefully we have a cold fall. But his research also revealed that acorn production in the East Cascades is especially is especially high, and especially in riparian areas. Here in this chart, you can see that Willamette Valley oaks and Puget Sound, Southern Oregon, Westside riparian, this is the mean acorn class, or the indicator of productivity. And you can see that it increases. Klickitat, Gorge, and Eastside riparian are at the higher end of the productivity scale. And these graphs just show you between Gorge and Klickitat oak production, acorn production, and Puget Sound, Southern Oregon, and Willamette Valley acorn production across the study period, that there was a high degree of synchrony even across ecoregions. So here there's a peak in the same year, and here's another peak, and then here's another peak. So high degree of synchrony across across the entire extent of oak. Sorry, I'm going to take a few drinks here. So following acorn germination, oak seedlings put a lot of energy into the roots, and they're super slow starters, which means they're easily overtopped by conifers. I'm going to see if I can minimize you guys. Can I do that? Yes, now you can see everything. So in fact, in one study, oaks were observed to completely die back at the crown. So the top of the oak died back for 5 to 21 years due to drought. And for that reason, often seedling roots can average 3 times older than the stem tissue. And access to water in that first growing season is really crucial for oak establishment, which is why oaks spend most of their energy growing down as youngins. They're looking for that water so that they can get established. So I know I personally have done a lot of oak planting, both from acorn and from bare root stock and potted oaks. And I was getting discouraged until I learned this fact. And I thought, wow, I wonder how many of those oaks that I perceive to be dead are actually just investing in their root growth, and that they will actually emerge in anywhere, hopefully in my lifetime. Oaks are really well adapted to fire. So they have waxy, fire-resistant leaves, they have thick bark, they invest in that root overshoot development, which helps with fire resilience. They have the ability to build new branches from dormant buds that are protected by that thick bark, and these are called epicormic branches. You can see what epicormic branching looks like in an oak right here. They kind of look a lot shaggier when they're branching epicormically. This can also sometimes be a stress response, but more often it's the result of a sudden increase in resources for whatever reason. It happens frequently when you release oak trees from competition, whether that competition was conifer or other oaks. With all these features, and also their ability to sprout from the root crown, like if the entire top of the tree is dead, it can sprout. This drawing kind of illustrates this concept. This is the skeleton of the plant that burned, and here come these emerging sprouts from the root crown of that tree. So the taproot was alive and intact, and off it went again. So oaks survive many fires that kill other tree species, and in the drier extent of the oak's range, oaks are the climax species. But fire still plays a really important role in maintaining structure, and also with respect to understory plant composition. This is a photo showing a mature oak that's dropped a whole lot of acorns that have subsequently germinated, and they're growing up beneath the crown of this mature tree. This is not likely a scenario you would see if there was a frequent low intensity fire regime, as was historically present. So most likely these younger kind of emerging seedlings would be thinned by fire. So this is something that's present across the landscape to varying degrees, and just something to be thoughtful about as we move forward with management. This is an example of a clear cut where the managers were prioritizing conifer development. And so there's been a lot of cutting and spraying of Oregon white oak on this property. In this case, these are resprouts. They're not dead, it's just fall. And you can see how vigorously they resprout from the stump. Columbia Land Trust learned this the hard way too, and we did a thinning project 15 years ago and had 40% of the stumps resprout, actually moving us farther away from our desired future condition. So lots to learn. Fire is plays the most critical role in the oak landscape where oaks are growing in other vegetation zones. So in Western Hemlock Zone, where Douglas fir can aggressively establish, they grow up over the tops of Oregon white oak and eventually can kill them. So in this regard, in these more mesic environments or wetter environments, oak is a successional species. Anthropogenic fires, like fires primarily lit by American Indians, were important for maintaining oak and prairie west of the Cascades, and they were lit frequently for thousands of years to maintain important first foods associated with oaks. But east of the Cascades, as Lavina suggested, people didn't need to light fires. They just needed to let them burn because there were so many ignitions just by lightning. Oaks can assume a great deal of different morphologies depending on the context in which they grow. So they tend to start out columnar in shape. They grow from a single acorn and they grow vigorously upward for the first few decades and then start to assume a new shape. And if they grow in a more open grown context, they'll assume this mushroom shape, kind of like is pictured here. If they grow in a more dense context, they can assume an inverted base shape, which is where they kind of grow up and out and find their own little piece of what looks like an oak crown, but it's comprised of multiple stems. So when oaks sprout from the root crown of a cut or burned stump, we call them clonal oak. So here's an example where a stem's been cut or burned and then it's resprouted. Clonal oak can assume any of the growth of the crown shapes, but they have, of course, the multiple stems that are contributing to that crown. And similar for the clump oaks, it's just that they emerge from multiple acorns that are closely spaced. So these are important things to understand because oaks provide cavities of all shapes and sizes, but the larger ones form in the boles of single-stemmed trees. And those are really important resources for wildlife. Animals can take refuge from predators and weather, and in some cases, as in the case of the western gray squirrel, here's some kits hanging out, they serve as natal dens or places where the young are actually birthed. So these kinds of cavities don't typically form in trees that grow in clumps, even when those clumps mature into what appears to be a single stem. This photo shows how acorns under the crown, or excuse me, basically these are multiple stems of Oregon white oak that have grown together. So these likely emerged from as stump sprout. And then as they matured, they grew together into what looks like a single stem. But you can see that if you took a cross section of this, you would see 5 or 6 individual stems and not a central cavity that is hollow and that can house wildlife. So that's just the difference between a single stemmed large oak and the cavity resources that it produces versus these multi-stemmed oak. This is significant because in light of climate change, we're anticipated to have hotter, drier, longer fire seasons that could potentially top kill more oak and lead to a greater prevalence of sprouted oak, which might offer different types of resources to wildlife and not some of these more limited types like these large bowl cavities. So in some of the climate science that's emerging and predictive models about impacts to Oregon white oak, it's actually a predicted expansion of Oregon white oak in the East Cascades, partly due to conifer, loss of conifer habitat, but also expansion eastward onto the Columbia Plateau. I don't know how far or along what gradients that expansion is anticipated to occur, but it'll be interesting to watch for. I already mentioned the phenomenon around the shrubbier oak, but we could also see novel plant communities, new plant assemblages, and new species utilization emerging across the oak landscape in response to climate change, and of course, species loss or habitat loss due to any number of variables and interactions between climate impacts and how that's expressed. In 2015, the Nature Conservancy launched a project called Conserving Nature's Stage, and that leans heavily on 2 premises. One is that geophysical features like cliffs and valleys and plateaus underlie the spatial distribution of biodiversity, and a region's biological richness is due in part to how geophysically diverse the landscape is. And the second premise is that a combination of that topoclimatic diversity and local permeability, so how easily animals and plants can move through the landscape, convey climate resilience to a landscape. So the modeling that the Nature Conservancy completed identified the East Cascades as a high likelihood of climate resilience because of its sharp moisture and precipitation gradients and its elevational gradients as well. So out of the 11 ecoregions that they assessed in that effort, the East Cascades demonstrated the second highest level of ecosystem diversity next to the Columbia Plateau, which was demonstrated the highest. So the idea here is that as things change, plants and animals may have an edge at adapting across the many connected gradients that are present in our region if they stay connected. And that's an important part of our strategic plan, is trying to preserve connectivity across those gradients to allow for species adaptation as the climate changes. And that's where conservation and stewardship and land use planning can all come into play. So how will we advance meaningful conservation? This was at the heart of our questions when we started strategic planning. The East Cascades Oak Partnership was born out of a 2015 conservation planning event hosted by Columbia Land Trust in Hood River. And during that meeting, a lot of our partners and stakeholders identified a shared interest in oak conservation, but they also identified a lack of collaboration and leadership and a lack of resources around oaks. So, sorry, having a drink. Pacific Birds provided some seed money to Columbia Land Trust, and we started exploring the feasibility of a partnership, and then off we went. So now we reach about 180 different individuals across more than 25 organizations, and those include tribes and agencies and conservation districts and other land trusts or nonprofits, a few small businesses, and a lot of interested private landowners. And we have a cooperative agreement that the core partners sign. So that gives people who sign on formally some decision-making authorities over the strategic direction of the partnership. And then we have members who are attending events and meetings and who are engaged in the actual work that the partnership is implementing. And we also form working groups, and we have advisory groups that help us with some of the project implementation. We organized our meetings around learning, and to date, we've heard more than 60 different speakers on topics ranging from ranching to lichens and land use planning and cultural resources. And we also hired a landscape historian who works for the National Park Service to comb through the historical record for mentions of oaks to help fill our knowledge gaps about historical condition. That's where a lot of that information earlier in the presentation came from. And we also hired a communications consultant to understand how best to deliver information to stakeholders. And so there's a lot of different tools and resources that ECOP is trying to develop to help support partners in implementing oak conservation. We also have a number of spatial tools and resources that we've developed. And we have some tools that we're still working on, some monitoring and assessment tools, outreach tools, and then best management practices. So those are all under development. So we also collaborated with Oregon State University's LEMA lab. LEMA is an acronym that stands, it's kind of a mouthful. It stands for Landscape Ecology, Modeling, Mapping, and Analysis Lab. And they helped us access FIA plot data. And if you don't know what FIA is, it's a Forest Inventory Analysis. And that's a federal effort to collect stand data, forest data, from plots on a 5-mile grid across the entire continental United States. And the LEMA lab used an approach called Gradient Nearest Neighbor to generate a map of oak extent based on that FIA plot data. there is very little spatial information about the distribution or condition of oak systems in the East Cascades, and there's even less peer-reviewed science about them informing management. There's a whole lot in the West Cascades, like in the Willamette Valley and the Puget Trough, and that's largely because of its proximity to universities, the fact that that part of the oak extent has been dramatically impacted by agriculture and development. Across the entire extent of Oregon white oak, 97% is estimated converted or lost to those different uses. So these Cascades host some of the most intact and certainly least fragmented oak habitat that remains throughout its entire extent. So we live in an important place, and it feels locally abundant, but it's actually regionally really important. I'm sorry, my husband just turned on some music. I'm gonna see if he can maybe turn it down. Hang on one second. Sarah, can you turn that down a bit? Oh, thank you. All right, sorry about that. Okay, where was I? Oh, so anyway, there's not a lot of spatial information about oak systems, and despite the incredibly diverse ways that oaks show up in the East Cascades, both around like their oak structure, so whether they're shrubby or large and open or really densely packed and growing in close proximity to one another, or with respect to the understory species, so all the plants that are growing underneath them or in association with them, oak systems in the East Cascades have always been lumped together as one system type, so kind of oversimplified as East Cascade oak and pine. And so we endeavored to assign some more specific classifications to better describe those oak systems, and that's going to become really important down the road when we start talking about management and conservation targets, because one oak system out here they're just not the same. So capturing that diversity was really important to the partnership early on. Our partners have remained highly engaged out of a hunger for management guidance and learning, because there's such a lack of research and guidance that currently exists. And we've built this partnership around those interests. And we're just trusting that as we build a shared base of understanding about the oak landscape, we'll also be setting into place important foundations for landscape scale conservation in the years to come. We rely on partners, the partnership relies on the partners to bring their unique perspective and expertise to our work. So we're trying to make sure that we have wide representation of voices that are contributing to our thinking. They help us improve networking and collaboration in and amongst themselves. They provide connections to stakeholders and potential partners and funders and landowners. They help demonstrate that there's a lot of support for this shared vision, and that support can help us secure funding and advance the work that we're doing together. And then, of course, they're the engine that actually makes the work happen. So they're helping to actively participate in project implementation and working groups. It is important to note that there's 8 different partnerships working on oak conservation across the extent of Oregon white oak. So from Northern California to Southern British Columbia. And I'm sorry, this somehow floated away from the map. I don't know what happened, but there it is. Way up north, there's this Gary Oak Ecosystem Recovery Team. There's the Cascadia Prairie Oak Partnership, CPOP, which actually hosts a really impressive conference every 2 years. This year in October, it will be hosting a conference in Vancouver. If you're interested in signing up for that, I highly encourage it. It's a great conference. And then there's a couple working in the kind of Portland metropolitan areas and Seattle area. There's the East Cascades Oak Partnership, which is east of the Cascades, Willamette Valley Oak and Prairie Cooperative, the Kalamaziski Oak Network, and then Northwestern California Oak Network. And Pacific Birds is kind of serving as an umbrella organization, and they're providing some support both financially and technically to all of these partnerships in an attempt to implement its business plan, which is this Prairie Oaks and Peoples document that identifies partnerships as a key strategy for advancing meaningful conservation. So just worth noting that we're collaborating with some of these other partnerships at the state and federal level to try to advance some of the strategies that are shared across all these different regions. So we spent 3 years trying to articulate what meaningful conservation looks like in the East Cascades. And the process, I think, was just as valuable as the actual document that emerged. And as I mentioned before, the partners have done a lot of learning together. We also interviewed stakeholders and we debated different strategies and we wrestled with results chains, which I'm sure many of you have also done. Thank you, OWEB. And ultimately, we decided to center our plan around human behaviors because those are the things we feel we have the best chances of changing. And those 6 kind of buckets that we characterize as primary human interactions are rural residential development, orchard and vineyards, grazing, fire suppression, and fur encroachment, which we lump together because though they're different mechanisms, they are related in terms of their ecological outcomes. Ecological stewardship and first foods and recreation. So an important aspect of, well, I guess first let me just describe some. These are those same interactions that are on this at the bottom of this graphic, and this just shows how some of these things result in ecological stressors across the oak landscape. You have disturbance where activity is displacing wildlife and introducing stress and altering behavior, which can impact plant communities and ecological processes like pollination and soil and hydrology. You have conifer encroachment, which is where the shade-tolerant vegetation displaces oak-associated species, and that can have severe consequences and lead to complete loss of habitat. And then that also can lead to altered structure and species composition. So as the canopy becomes more shaded out, then not only the oak change, but are kind of, I don't know what the right word is, suppressed. The understory species associated with oak are also changing. And there's changes in stand density, in fuel types, and in the fuel profile. There's changes in the tree form, and that has impacts on habitat features. There's invasive weedy species that alter food webs and ecological processes. And all of those changes can result from fire suppression, from poorly informed stewardship, or from poorly timed grazing. And those also have impacts on cultural values. So you can lose pollinator forage that can threaten native vegetation and crops. You can have reduced forage quality for grazing through the proliferation of invasive annual grasses and weeds that just don't offer as much nutrition as some of those native forbs and grasses. You can have emerging pests that introduce new stressors into the system. And these, as well as the altered structure and species composition, can lead to altered fire behavior, both in terms of the fuel types, the flame heights, the intensity of fire, how rapidly or how widely it spreads. So all of these things kind of contribute to overall this diminished climate resilience and loss of biodiversity. And then there's also, of course, just outright conversion and fragmentation, which, you lose entire trophic structures and habitat features, and you also limit the ability of species to move through the landscape. So it's kind of a cascade of impacts sometimes as traditional foods also is just diminished access for hunting and gathering. So an important aspect of conservation planning is spatial. And as I mentioned before, we were pretty much starting from scratch with respect to existing assessments or data sets around East Cascade oaks. But we used the spatial data that was available across the entire region. So that was important. It needed to be comparable across Oregon and Washington. So we relied on that FIA plot data. And again, that's collected on a 5-mile grid and on a 10-year rotation. So every plot is revisited every decade. And the resolution of that data is not really sufficient to capture the site scale diversity or to accurately reflect how ecotonal our region is. So, you might, within a 5-mile, you can stand anywhere, and within 5 miles, you might pass through 3 or 4 different oak system types, just because there's so much topographic diversity. The diversity in aspect, you can stand on the Klickitat River on the north-facing slope and be in, conifer forest, and then go stand on the south facing slope and you're in like this arid grassland. So, and you might only be like 40 linear feet away from each position where you're standing. So really, really sharp ecotones and really fine scale microclimates and diversity. So that wasn't satisfying, that resolution of that data, but it is the only data that we had available to us. So we ran with it. We accepted that we were going to be doing kind of looking for trends at a landscape scale resolution. And we found that the data did tell us a compelling story about oak system diversity and connectivity and climate resilience. And this model was constructed to tell us where the biggest patch sizes were, where there was the greatest amount of oak system diversity, where there was a higher probability of having an intact understory plant community, where there was a higher predicted terrestrial resilience and permeability score, where there was predicted presence of rare, threatened, or endangered species, and where there were actual documented occurrences of priority plant species. And the model revealed these results that the dark green are kind of where those scores were greatest, and then gradient down to the dark red where it was lower. And I want to emphasize that the model is just one layer of information. It's not a conclusive tool, and it relies, of course, on the values that we tell it to use to generate these results. So those can change over time, and it also doesn't mean that the oak systems or individual occurrences of oak that occur in these lower priority areas are not important or that aren't worthy of conservation. That's certainly not the intent of this exercise. This exercise meant to reveal these landscape scale patterns of where there's less fragmentation and higher resilience, and et cetera. So we took that along with partner input, and we added some important corridors that we felt were important to maintain across gradients and between established conservation areas. And we came up with this map. And this is really a starting place. We're developing monitoring and assessment tools that will not only help us assess the extent and current condition of oaks on this landscape, but that can help us build data about how oak systems respond to disturbance and management, and help address that gap of research and knowledge around management practices. So we hope that the many strategies that we deploy will be available to landowners and partners anywhere in the oak landscape. So this isn't meant to be exclusive. This does kind of point us to places where if we deploy tools like assessment tools, we might start in these higher priority conservation areas. So I'm going to circle back real quick to the 6 primary ways that people are interacting with oak systems. And for each of these 6, we interviewed stakeholders who represent decision makers or influencers, or who represent the values and the needs that these interactions represent. And the purpose of the interviews was to understand why people make the decisions that they make and what the contributing factors that we might be able to change or influence to get them to make a different decision might be. So this involved interviews, as I mentioned, followed by sometimes painfully complex discussions and rankings of what we called impacts. And we made a conscious decision to talk about impacts as opposed to threats, just simply because we felt like the word threat conveyed this sense of intention. And oftentimes, I think people have negative impacts on ecological systems in complete ignorance, and certainly not with much intent in any event. So we interviewed stakeholders. We brainstormed strategies around the contributing factors that we identified, and then we brainstormed how those, well, we ran these through results chains. And if you haven't used results chains, they're basically like logic models that help you identify weak assumptions in your thinking. And obviously, we're not meant to go through these together. They're very complex. The gray boxes represent ideas. So these are all strategies that we came up with to address contributing factors in our landscape. And so there's way too many to do, to act on necessarily. So this was an important part of our brainstorm. And then later came the paring down and the strategy sessions. So there's also this, this spatial element where, we want to understand at a finer scale what the spatial extent of some of those interactions are. So we built these map atlases at the watershed scale, explaining that demonstrate some of the impacts of human behavior. So we had these maps produced for all the watersheds throughout our service area. And this one, I just chose an example. This is a grazing potential map. And this was built with a combination of public grazing allotments. So we mapped those just outright, knowing that they're very likely to be grazed. From field level data for hay and pasture from Washington State Department of Agriculture, from land cover classes for hay, pasture, herbaceous, and shrub layers. And then they were stratified by slope to indicate grazing potential, because oftentimes some of the most intact plant communities that we find in the oak landscape are on very steep slopes where cattle didn't have access. So that's just an example of one of these impact maps that we developed. And then we used those to discern kind of what we were going to do and where. And so I'm just going to go through a quick summary of each of these 6 interactions and how we distilled these really complex results chains into a few concise statements about what our strategies are going to be. And it's important to remember that there's still a great deal of valuable detail behind the scenes. So in some ways, for me, knowing how much thought and careful attention to detail went into this, it's a little bit startling to see it kind of boil down into these big strategy, this kind of vague strategy language, but there's a lot of great information kind of behind the scenes that we'll be using as well. So we're going to start with the highest ranking impact, which was rural residential development. And, conversion is usually irreversible, and it's severe with respect to fragmentation and disturbance and displacement of native species and disrupted ecological processes like fire, because we often, understandably, want to protect our infrastructure and promote human safety. So we suppress fires around the wildland-urban interface. On the other hand, people who live in the oak landscape know it the best, and they often love it the most. And with a little support, we believe that they'll go to lengths to steward it for improved ecological outcomes if they're armed with information and resources. So the strategies that we develop then include traditional land protection. So we're really wanting to focus on those uniquely intact oak systems that haven't been degraded in the understory, because oak understory is incredibly difficult to restore once it's been severely damaged by overgrazing or other kinds of disturbances that change the understory plant composition. We want to work on establishing management guidance for landowners. We also want to do this in the context of, landowners have a great spectrum of management goals, for everything from, raising commercially valuable conifer species or grazing livestock, or, they have a particular aesthetic they prefer. So we want to develop some management practices that are responsive to those other goals. We also want to build and expand on incentive programs and empower landowners in these strategic locations. So starting in those connectivity corridors and those conservation priority areas to manage for specific outcomes. And we also want to ensure that planning and permitting processes and the decision makers who are behind those processes have information about the oak landscape that will help them make decisions that can reduce impacts to oaks. I think these maps were really interesting because they demonstrate how effective Oregon's land use planning system is. When you look over here at potential new structures, you can see that the entire Clickstack County is just lit up as having a high density of potential structures, and Oregon not so much. You have a few pockets clustered around existing development. Same is true with number of existing parcels. Of course, those are already kind of concentrated in these urban areas, but you can see in Clickstack County, it's much more widespread. And then also with respect to existing structures, and you've got these clusters, and here it's kind of, the yellow is kind of more widespread across the extent of the county. So just thought that was interesting and wanted to give a shout out to Oregon's land use planning system. Good on you. So fire suppression and conifer encroachment. The East Cascades region is really dry, it's windy, and it's hot in the summer, and there's frequent wildfires ignited by lightning and by people, mostly accidental. So fire suppression efforts that began over a century ago with kind of higher tech equipment and greater investment in terms of like commercial timber and infrastructure has led to a higher tree and shrub density, to accumulation of fuels on the forest floor, to proliferation of fire-sensitive vegetation. So instead of fire-adapted vegetation, you have vegetation that would not typically grow where there's a frequent fire regime. And then an elevated risk of catastrophic fire, kind of cumulatively, all those different impacts. So in the absence of fire, the tree composition in wetter areas, like kind of where Hood River and white salmon are situated, shifts more towards Douglas fir and other conifers. And without any intervention, these conifers can grow tall enough to shade out oaks, causing mortality. And because this process takes decades to play out, many landowners don't even realize it's happening. And so passive management becomes a significant threat to oak habitat. Currently, 60% of these cascades, we estimate, of the oak landscape is at risk for conifer encroachment, and 42% of those acres occur on private land. So there's a real opportunity, especially because there's so much interest in fire readiness for getting these practices onto the landscape. This is an example of a oak release project. This is a before and after of the same site. So a lot of competing conifers were removed. There's still two kind of in the foreground, so it's a little bit difficult to tell, but this stand changed so dramatically. It felt like you're standing in a different place. It was really remarkable release project. So, and you know, a bonus for releasing oak from conifer encroachment is that it can often pay for itself, because the material that you're removing for the goal of ecological restoration is actually commercially valuable. So you can sell it to the mill, or, you know, for wood chips or what have you, hop poles, and generate money to help pay for the treatment and possibly profit as well. So we believe that people will be highly motivated to promote defensible space, and that oaks can play a central role in accomplishing that. So you can still have oaks be part of your landscape in the wildland-urban interface, because they're so resistant to fire, and promote defensible space at the same time. So, you know, fire readiness will save lives and infrastructure and, gosh, like economies and habitat. So we saw when the smoke during the wildfires last year basically shut things down in Hood River and white salmon for a full month. And that was a really severe impact on local businesses. So important for us to be thoughtful about how we can prepare for a longer fire season and a more intensive fire season in the future. The strategies that we developed around fire suppression and conifer encroachment then are to get best management practices out into the hands of the people who need them. So in the oak landscape, to build awareness about the problem. Like I mentioned, passive, just kind of lack of awareness is one of the primary hurdles to releasing oaks. We want to make sure that we're directing existing funding and incentive programs toward those areas that are most at risk. We want to help design and put into action a prescribed fire program that builds capacity, like local resources for responding to fire and also for implementing prescribed fire. That's something that has to be done safely, because it sets a precedent for anyone who wants to use prescribed fire across the entire American West. But I think it's something that we kind of need to manage toward and figure out how to make that a tool in our toolbox. It's frequently employed on public lands, but it's been really difficult to implement on private ground. So I know both states have initiatives that are working toward that goal. And then we also want to make sure that we're working toward whatever we can do to facilitate the release of these high priority oak stands that are being encroached on by conifer, whether that means that we have a conservation buyer or manager doing the work, or that we purchase land to actually facilitate the restoration work, or just work with private landowners through incentive programs and outreach. Grazing is another really important human interaction on the landscape. Raising livestock is a signature part of the East Cascades economy and our rural lifestyle. Grazing has helped secure large landscapes against development, and it can be used as a management tool to promote specific outcomes in the oak understory when it's deployed carefully. But it's also, it can lead to invasive weedy grasses that proliferate when there's aggressive grazing. Those grasses offer poorer forage for livestock, and they grow in dense mats that alter fire behavior. So it's very different from when a native perennial bunchgrass burns. Native perennial bunch grasses grow deeper and bulkier roots with each season, and they store a lot of the carbon underground. So it can play an important role in carbon sequestration. And they naturally maintain space between plants that support other diverse flowering forbs, which do not persist in these extensive mats of annual grasses. This is Medusa head that's just like completely taken over this oak pine savanna. And here's an example of an intact savanna. So you can have kind of grassier dominated savanna, and you can have forb dominated savanna. So, grazing can have really profound impacts on the ecological diversity in these systems. And we believe that there are ways to tweak grazing practices, and we're hoping to develop some partnerships with some local ranchers to explore that and integrate those practices into our best management practice recommendations. But we're also interested in identifying locations where there still is an intact understory and trying to protect it from overgrazing. So that's a really critical thing, because it's very, very difficult to restore these ecological systems after they're so heavily impacted by these invasive annual grasses. It takes a great deal of effort and time, and in some cases feels virtually impossible. So prioritizing the protection of still intact ecosystems is really a critical tool in response to grazing. Let's see. Orchards and vineyards are a lesser threat in terms of the extent, but as in other regions of Oregon, wine grapes and fruit orchards thrive in the same space and soil types as Oregon white oaks, and they're profitable, they're popular. People don't stop drinking when there's an economic downturn. And so with anticipated increases in demand, that's just going to exacerbate the current risk to our ecoregion. And there does seem to be an interest from producers in other regions to buy land here and build orchards and vineyards. So, beyond the shifts that happen when you make room for crops and infrastructure, like complete habitat loss, there's stress to oak systems that occurs through, the introduction of invasive species or noise disturbance, changes to air and water quality. Sometimes exhausted land can require the use of herbicides or pesticides or fertilizers. There is oftentimes wildlife that will, predate on the crops, and so that can introduce tension between the human use and the ecosystem function. There can be emerging pathogens or funguses that can damage or even kill oaks and associated species. So, fortunately, farmers are really aware of plant and soil responses to their farming practices. So I think it stands to reason that they'll be motivated to try to understand and implement practices that are beneficial both for their profits and for ecological outcomes, especially when you consider the relationship between pollinators and crops. And they're also they sell their product. Their product is branded on like ecosystem health. Often it's often really regionally, their brands are couched in regional beauty and regional health. And so it stands to reason that these producers would be interested in practices that help promote those ideas. So again, our strategies are common to land protection, identifying those places that are unique and trying to prevent expansion of uses that would destroy those uniquely intact oak systems using land protection tools, and then developing and distributing agricultural best management practices. And our partners in the Willamette Valley have implemented a program called the Oak Accords, and they're interested in helping us explore whether the Oak Accords could be a model that worked for our region. It helps producers understand and deploy practices in agriculture that support a variety of different ecological goals. And then it also provides resources and technical support. We are also looking at, supporting research to provide technical assistance and incentive programs. So recreation is also an important interaction in the oak landscape, but one that is, we have interpreted to have a relatively low impact on oak systems. Now that certainly changed. I think in recent years, the recreation load in the gorge has just exploded. I know most people who live here feel that. So something to pay attention to. We identified a number of different ways that the specific human behaviors that contribute to change, to impacts from recreation, and those are primarily fire suppression. There's a lot of concern about loss of access after the Eagle Creek fire, and that was a catastrophic fire. I'm not necessarily characterizing that as an ecologically productive fire, but where productive fires do occur and necessitate closures, or where there's a management entry that needs to occur, like conifer encroachment, or go in and remove the established spurs, that can often generate public opposition with people who either like it the way it is, they don't want to lose access during the treatment, or they oppose the arguments or the principles behind the goals. So those can be challenges. There's of course issues around permeability and animal movements. There's issues around vectors of invasive species, and noise and disturbance. So a lot of different ways that we're out there using the landscape that can have impacts on oak systems. And our strategies there are to try to identify and implement practices that help people who are managing popular recreation areas make decisions in the oak landscape that will minimize impacts. We had some ideas around creating an outreach campaign to increase the understanding of the public about oak systems, to ensure that planning and recreation industry entities have access to information about these impacts. So there's a lot of like apps and, even like Travel Oregon is promoting the Columbia River Gorge, or was for a while. So making sure that the information is in the hands of the people who are promoting these things, so they can pass it on to their audiences, would be potentially impactful. And then there were some ideas around tax use classifications and providing incentives for landowners to keep their land in a natural resource classification, as opposed to subdividing and selling it because they're frustrated with the tax burden when they're in, ad valorem tax classification. And then we talked about developing a shared enforcement and restoration strategy with landowners who are struggling with overwhelmed recreation sites. So instead of everybody fending for themselves, can we somehow create standardized signage, standardized enforcement, and some kind of voluntary or like a permit system where people are exposed to best practices when you're recreating, and that allows you to get, a sticker that you put on your windshield, and you can park in this lot, if you have gone through this training or this educational opportunity. So those are some ideas around recreation. And then because it's important that we also look at our own behaviors with the same lens. Ecological stewardship is practiced by people whose main goal is to improve ecological outcomes in priority habitats, or for first foods, or for other target management species. And it's our job, to make choices that impact ecological integrity. And through habitat restoration and weed control and managing public access and burning and fire suppression, and the list goes on. And while management can occasionally seek to influence outcomes for one system or species type, sometimes that compromises the needs of other species or other goals on the landscape. So we can often have unintended consequences. We can make decisions without adequate information. We can, I think we all intimately understand how our management actions can impart a whole cascade of effects on system function and integrity. So we're often also managing some of the most intact or fragile resources in the landscape that have already been protected. And so that kind of ups the ante in terms of management decision making. So we want to make sure that we are building our shared knowledge around how oak systems are responding to disturbance events, including those that we create through our management, that we're developing projects on a strong adaptive framework. So we're monitoring and we're understanding the impacts that we're having, and those are feeding back into our tools. That we are increasing capacity and our efficiency for stewardship activities. We can develop shared crews, we can engage in some shared training opportunities, we can fundraise together, we can be, as is the case with this plan, strategic about where partners are focusing resources to try to cumulatively impact shared goals. And then we can build and maintain a culture of learning and responsiveness. And this is really key to ECOP's approach. We like to hear from a variety of voices about what the management goals are, what the contributing factors to the decision making is, and how our conservation strategies are impacting people's lives. And we can use all that information to make better choices, more strategic, less painful choices about oak conservation in this landscape. So, we have a lot to learn, a lot relies on adaptive management. And this is not meant to be digested in this short time frame. This is just showing that for each ecological outcome that we identified around our conservation goals, we have some measurable metrics that we're going to try to perform to. And we haven't necessarily developed any quantitative targets for most of these, but this is the direction that we're headed and how we're going to demonstrate that the strategies that we successfully implement are actually having the intended impact on the landscape. You can find our planning documents. There's a 150-page version on our website, and there's like a 16-page summary. So it depends on your appetite for the details. But those documents are available. There's some nice graphics and photos and narratives in there that we encourage partners to utilize freely when they're writing grant applications and submitting public comments and whatever you're doing in the name of protecting oak. So I was going to show you this magic little beast too, which is our attempt at summarizing that 150-page document on one page. I think we did okay. There's strategies here, down here at the bottom, and you'll notice these little references. This is actually rural residential strategy number 1 and ecological stewardship strategy number 1. So these all tie back to those individual human interactions. And then we try to kind of put those individual strategies from each of those into buckets that are across all the different interactions. And then these are the implementation results. So as we're implementing our strategies, what does successful implementation look like for each of these strategies? And then if we successfully implement those, are we having the intended ecological outcomes? And these are the ecological outcomes that we will be developing quantitative metrics for. These are, of course, the goals that we stated at the beginning. And then these are some of the community outcomes that we also hope to be able to measure someday in the future, or at least talk about and hope for, that crops and forests and homes are protected from wildfire, that local communities are fluent in oak system ecology. Just knowing the names of things can really dramatically change your awareness and your respect for the other organisms that we share home with. That health and economic impacts from smoke are reduced, that forage for domestic livestock is improved, that eco-recreational tourism is supported, that there's safe access to first foods and it's widely available, that natural resource jobs are still core to our local economy, agricultural crops are pollinated and resist pests, and that conservation is reflecting the voices of diverse communities. And let's see. Oh, I did also want to just real quickly talk about the convergence with your strategic plan, Watershed 2040, where I saw convergence anyway. And that would be around like upland land conservation that can help put water rights back in stream, land conservation that includes riparian oak systems that can provide riparian restoration opportunities. So kind of leveraging or opening up access for riparian restoration through the conservation of adjacent uplands, preparing the landscape for wildfire that can possibly prevent sediment slugs from entering streams in the steeper gradient Hood River, parts of the Hood River watershed. And then promoting research priorities that can help us understand water and carbon budgets in these oak systems and trophic cascades. And trophic cascades are particularly interesting to me. I was reading a paper that really got my wheels turning, and I put the citation here in case you want to track it down. But it showed how fish indirectly facilitate terrestrial plant reproduction through these cascading trophic interactions across these ecosystem boundaries. And in this case, it was adult dragonflies, which feed on insect pollinators and can alter pollinator behavior. And so when the fish were present in ponds, they reduced the larval dragonfly abundance through predation, and then fewer adult dragonflies emerged to harass the pollinators, and the pollinator visits to nearby plants increased. So fish-free ponds, ponds with no fish, had much fewer pollinator visits. So I'm sure interactions go both ways across those ecosystem gradients, and we just have so much to learn about them, but I thought that would be a fun note to end on, which is like curiosity. I think sometimes these connections between animal or species behavior, and it's just fascinating to me, and I think there's no end to what we don't know, and that's one of the reasons that I find my job so satisfying, as Cindy mentioned when she was introducing me, is just the learning. It's like constant. It's very humbling, but it's also just really engaging. So I've been real appreciative of the opportunity to advance the Oaks partnership, which is really focused on learning and some of those shared strategies. So thank you for listening to me go on and on. I did want to acknowledge some of our funders, Pacific Birds and the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, Cornell Lab of Ornithology and the Land Trust Alliance, the Hess Family Foundation. Thank you, Susan and Jurgen. The Leader Family Foundation, the Goodman Family Foundation, Oregon Department of Forestry, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. And of course, our partners who make the world go round. So thank you for listening, and happy to take questions. I don't know if you guys, would you recommend that I stop sharing the screen and do we just go back to
yes,
video
that would
format?
be good, Lindsay.
Okay. I will stop my share.
Yeah, you can always reshare it if somebody does want you to pull it back up. That's fine too. So everybody, feel free to unmute yourself. I want to say, Lindsay, that was a fantastic presentation. You did a really good job having attempted to do this 2 months ago for the Watershed Action Plan. You did a fantastic job of, really thoroughly giving us a sense of all the work that the group did. So does anybody want to shout out with a question? Otherwise, I will read.
I have a question, Cindy.
Yep.
If I
Very
can
good.
go.
Please,
Okay.
yes.
Lindsay, that was an excellent presentation. That was just wonderful. And I liked the breadth of it. And you got into some very sensitive issues like land use planning, the difference between Clickitat County or Hood River County. Question I have is, I'm sure you know Drew and Merritt from Humble Roots. Mm-hmm. And last summer or last fall, there was the Mosier Creek fire. Oregon Department of Forestry was in charge. After the fire was all controlled, Oregon Department of Forestry had a contractor come in and cut these giant pines and oaks right next to Drew and Merritt's house. He said, well, these are hazardous. So the question rather than getting into the specifics of that issue, I'm wondering if you've had some traction with Oregon Department of Forestry, particular in after the fire. You know, that's what this case was. Fire was controlled, but it was, I don't know if Drew has calmed down yet. So anyway, could you speak to that?
Yeah, I can. And actually, we had a ECOP meeting like right after that happened. And we just happened to be talking, like the theme for the meeting was around fire suppression and emergency response. It was kind of fortuitous in that regard. I felt badly for them. But what we talked about was primarily intervention points in this giant apparatus that is the fire suppression system, right? There's these mentalities and these practices that are in place that are military in nature. They're highly controlled because there's safety issues in fire response. You have to have, similar to the military, you have to have people who are willing to follow orders so that there's organization and there's adherence and there's good judgment. So that's a really difficult system, I think, to influence and to change. And, you know, I've talked with so many people, both at ODF, at Washington DNR, at the Forest Service, who feel like there's definitely some young energy around the idea of constructive fire. And there's an appetite for prescribed fire that I think is emerging, but it's a big ship to change course. And it probably will take some retirements. It'll probably take policy. It'll take public support and public outreach. And then, you know, I think a lot of these practices that we might try to promote are really going to hinge on whether we can demonstrate safety and successful implementation. So it's a steep hill to climb, but I think we're all motivated to try. And there's a number of efforts underway to, for example, limit landowner liability around prescribed fire and give public agencies authority to burn on private land. But with respect to the mop-up, which I think is where Kristen and Drew experienced some hardship, there are information officers on every fire. And so we talked about trying to prepare an outreach piece that private landowners can just hand to those information officers. And theoretically, that information, like landowner preferences for mop-up and preferences for aggression around like how aggressive should the suppression effort be or for specific resources, that information can get conveyed very quickly to the information officer and hopefully kind of trickle down through the chain of command. But it's a big, cumbersome, complex system with so many different authorities and so many, anyway, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky landscape. And I feel like we're just starting to understand how it works ourselves. So I still have a ton to learn, and maybe someone on this call even has perspective deeper than mine.
Thank you, Lindsay. I just would recommend that you get Kirsten and Drew involved in that because they have that personal experience of what happened, and they're also very knowledgeable about ecological relationships and native oaks and things. So if there's a way to get them personally involved, I'd sure recommend that.
Yeah, thank you. They are actively engaged in the partnership. So when we have opportunities to get feedback on like the tools that we're developing and the outreach messages and some of the like practical, tools, I guess is the best word, that we're trying to get in the hands of landowners, we would love to have them review or participate in building those.
Okay, any other question there? Anybody?
You know, the depths of, may I, Chuck?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. What was it, the depth of that? You know, my first career was city planning, and we didn't go in, you know, for the city of Portland and the city of, you know, Denver Urban Renewal. We didn't go into that much depth on some things. I mean, is that possible that could be a curriculum for a college course?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I feel like the more questions you ask and the deeper you get, you just generate more questions. But I think that's just the nature of learning, and that's the beautiful part of it. You know, it's funny because there's we have so many questions. And in fact, we just went through an exercise where we tried to prioritize our research questions, and you know, we had like 150 topics or something crazy, you know, that we're like, we really want answers to these questions, and they all feel so urgent and so compelling. That's one of our goals, is to engage academia in those questions, and we've actually had a few graduate students engage on those questions through Columbia Land Trust, and it's been really valuable. We have now not published papers, but at least like thesis papers about certain topics that are popular management questions, like around subsprout control and response to thinning. And we just finished developing that tool that I may have mentioned, I can't remember, around monitoring oak response to disturbance mechanisms. So we just built, based on the FIA, the Forest Inventory Analysis guidebook, which is like a manual that's that thick. We took some of those practices as like a baseline, and then we built these new protocols that are specific to Oregon white oak that will maybe help us answer some of those questions without really expensive academic, you know, research projects. So we're kind of trying to come at that tangentially. I don't know if we know enough to teach a course, but we're happy to engage academia in whatever way it will engage to help us answer some of these questions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else have a question?
And I'm not seeing anything in the chat box, Chuck, so.
There was a compliment from Christina. Excellent presentation, Lindsay. And I think unless someone has another question, that's a good segue into everyone unmuting here for a moment. And we're going to give a big round of applause to Lindsay. That was an amazing presentation. You spoke nonstop for an hour and 20 minutes, and have an amazing amount of knowledge. And we really appreciate it. I think everyone really learned a lot with that. So thank you very much, Lindsay.
You are welcome.